Hi, Tim Hart here. I want to talk to you about the red flags that I sometimes see when I'm looking and evaluating a commercial property. So just some of the things to look out for that need a little bit further investigation. So the first one is long-term vacancies. So you might find a property and it's been, had some vacancies for, a couple of years, especially if you're looking in a regional setting. I've seen this quite a lot. So just be careful of, why has it been vacant that long? And how long are you going to put in your feasibility as to how long you think it'll take you to lease it up? If they haven't been able to lease it up for 3 years, why do you think you're going to be able to do it in 3 months or 6 months or whatever it might be? So just something to look at. And why has it been? Is the rents too high? Is it the location? To make sure that you're not going to be taking on someone else's issue. The next big one is above market rents. So where you might think, oh great, this property's got a fantastic yield, but when you look at the actual rent that the tenant is paying, and usually we look at the rate per square metre that the tenant is paying, they're paying above market rent. And that's really dangerous, because what it might mean is that the end of their term, the end of their lease, which might be coming up in a year or 2 years, then that tenant is most likely going to ask for a market review, and then all of a sudden your income drops, and then therefore the value of that property drops significantly. So you really need to make sure that you find something that they're paying market rent, or ideally the flip side is to find a property where they're paying under market rent. Therefore you can get the opposite effect of, hey, when they come up for renewal, you might be able to increase their rent and therefore increase the value of the property. The next one is a low WALE, or weighted average lease expiry. So it just means that you've got some tenants in that property that have their lease coming up for renewal. So what that means is that you might suddenly have a tenant that says, yep, you know what, I'm going to vacate, and now all of a sudden you've got a vacancy in there. So you really need to make sure, if you've got some tenants that are coming up due, just go and have a chat with them and ask them, how's business? And ask them the direct question: Are you going to extend? Amazing the results you find. Sometimes I've been able to chat to a tenant and they've said, oh yeah, business is going great. Yeah, we're definitely staying. So that's just something that I can have in the back of my mind to go, okay, great, I'm very confident that they're going to extend now, that I'm not going to suddenly have a lot of vacancies in my property. The next big one is a big red flag for us is having one tenant that takes up the majority of the space. Okay, this just comes down to why I don't buy single tenanted commercial properties. If you lose that tenant, you lose all your income. Same sort of goes if you've got a tenant that takes up 50 or even more percent of the space, then that's a big risk, and I'm going to want to do a lot of due diligence on that tenant. Am I comfortable they're going to be sticking around? Because they're going to be most likely the anchor of the centre. So I really want to make sure that I'm not going to be able to, I'm not going to lose them. Ideally I'd like a centre where I've only got, each tenant only takes up 5 to 10% of the rent. So that if I do lose them, okay, it's not the end of the world. I'm still going to be able to make all the payments, pay all the outgoings, pay the mortgage, all that sort of thing. The next one I see a lot of is where you might have the vendor, or the seller is actually the tenant. So, and I see this in the centre. So it might be, there might be an office building, there's 10 offices. Typically I'll find the vendor is one of the tenants. And usually it comes around where they looking for a premises to rent, and they thought, why not, I'll just buy the whole building and I'll rent out the other offices. So it's a really good question to ask the real estate agents, is the seller or is the tenant, the vendor, one of the tenants? And it's not always an issue, but it might mean that you can negotiate with for them to extend their term, as part of the deal. But also you'll find that because they're a tenant, they're effectively paying themselves. I often find that the amount of rent they're paying is quite high, because the higher the rent, the higher the income, the higher the value of the property. So they try and artificially inflate the income from the centre by paying themselves, a really high rate per square metre. So just make sure you're looking at that rate per square metre that they're paying to make sure that it is in line with market. The next one is there a new centre that's been opened up, or is going to be opened up in the coming future. So what you don't want is, you've got a commercial property in a certain part of town, but there's a whole new Woolworths or a whole new centre that's been opened up on the other side of town, and that's where all the business is going, and that's where all the customers are going, and you're going to be stuck in the old dead end of town. So just be wary, I guess, with your research as to what's opening up around the area, what competition is there for your centre, and ultimately customers for your centre. Another big one to look at is the arrears on the rental. So if you've got some tenants in there, I always want to ask, okay, how are they paying? Let me see what the arrears are on this centre. Because if you've got some tenants or even multiple tenants that are in arrears and have been in arrears for a long time, I want to know why. Because that might mean that they can't afford the rent, and that suddenly you're going to have an issue on your hand where the tenant can't afford the rent, and then all of a sudden they're going to be closing down that store. So that's a real high indicator that the rents are too high for that particular property. Another big one is the outgoings. So I want to look at what the outgoings are, and there's two things to this. You don't want them to be too high, and you don't want them to be too low. So you don't want the outgoings to be too high, because ultimately that's an expense that your tenants have to pay. And if your outgoings are high, then it means there's less, sort of net rent that a tenant is prepared to pay. And this is just comparing your property to similar properties in the area. If your centre is paying $50 a square metre outgoings, but the one next door is only paying $25, then obviously a tenant is going to prefer the one that has the lower cost. So you really need to look at the detailed breakdown of what is being spent on this centre. And another indication of high outgoings could be there might be some maintenance or something, some issue with the property as to why they're suddenly spending a lot of money on this centre. The other one is you don't want the outgoings to be too low. And the reason for that is if I see the outgoings too low, I often think to myself, what's missing? What is the owner not putting in there? Or what have they not spent? What maintenance have they not done on this property that's now affecting this property? And ultimately what they might be doing is trying to reduce the outgoings, which then makes the centre have a higher net income, which means it increases the value of the property. Okay, so they're always going to try and, I guess, put the lowest outgoings possible in there to make it so that the centre looks like it's performing at its best. The last one I want to cover is high Capex or capital expenditure requirements. So you might be looking at a property and saying, oh, look, I can buy this property, it's a 10% yield, this is great, but when you actually look at the capital that's required to maintain that property, it could be astronomical, and you need to add that onto the purchase price. So as an example, we were looking at a centre in Mackay as an $8 million building. And when we did a lot of due diligence, all the air conditioning units were nearly 20 to 25 years old. So they're right at the end of their life cycle. And that was, to put new air conditioning units was $600,000. There was also some few other items, but there was, in the end of the day, it was about a $750,000 Capex expenditure that we would have had to incur in the next year to 1 to 2 years that has to be factored in. Because that's ultimately, a price that we're going to have to pay in the very short term. So that's another thing that you really need to factor in. What's my purchase price plus all the capital expenditure I'm going to have to do to bring this property up to where it should be, and that's the real price. And what yield am I getting on that price? So because there's a lot of sort of red flags and little things that aren't particularly deal killers, but just something you need to factor in when you're looking to purchase a property. So if commercial property is something of interest for you, head over to activepropertygroup.com.au for more information. And as always, thanks for watching.